The War of 1812, starring your friends Shiv and Om. The War of 1812.
The War of 1812 was a war that happened due to the problems between the U.S. and the British Empire.
There were many problems with the relationship between the British and the U.S. These include the lack of land, U.S. freedom, and the choices they were allowed to make. Before we talk about the War of 1812, let's go back a couple of years to Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. You may be asking yourself, who was Napoleon? He was a military leader, very famous from 1789 when the French Revolution had started, until he had crowned himself emperor in 1804 and died several years later. The Napoleonic Wars started in 1803 when Napoleon wanted to get revenge on the British after losing a war many years before. These wars were from 1803 to 1815. By the end of the war, Napoleon had won and died 6 years later in 1821. Though there were Napoleonic Wars, let's talk about the War of 1812 with Great Britain and the U.S. A big reason why this war had started is when Great Britain refused to surrender Western forts as promised in the Treaty of Paris, which had been signed after the American Revolutionary War. This war had over 30,000 men fighting, and no declared winner. There were many downfalls to this war, and many things that could have been avoided. Two things that definitely could be avoided were the 15,000 Americans and the 8,600 British who had died, and the loved White House being burnt. Let's talk about someone very famous during this war, and that is none other than himself, Mr. William Hull. William was a great politician and judge before the war, but after he had declared war with the British, he had turned into a general, and a very successful one. He had led many attacks, especially the very famous one, the surrender at Detroit. As William and his army neared Sandwich, close to Windsor, he had been trapped and cornered by one of Britain's greatest leaders, Sir Isaac Brock. William Hull surrendering to Sir Isaac Brock was just the start of Britain destroying the U.S. After many fights such as the Battle of Baltimore and York, now known as Toronto, Britain was beating the U.S., but Britain had sealed a deal when they burnt the White House, leaving the U.S. hopeless of winning this war. After this dramatic event, both sides had signed the Treaty of Ghent. This treaty was a peace treaty, negotiated for 4 months and signed December 24th of 1814. This treaty was later put to use in early 1815. After this treaty was put into use, there were no further consequences, and the War of 1812 had been finished. Remember, this was based on a true story. Please do not try this at home. And thank you for listening.